What I'm going to talk about today is a few different things. I'm interested in lots of things. That's my problem. It's sort of a fun thing though too, because if you're interested in lots of things, you sort of dibble and dabble around here and there, and you get to meet all kinds of different people, and you get all kinds of different ideas about things, and sometimes it works out that they all come together. So I've been working on the Mississippi Valley for a long, long time. I've been interested in rivers actually since I was a little kid. I grew up in Sioux City, and I didn't know it at the time, but I witnessed basically the destruction of a large river valley. I used to go fishing down there with my grandpa, and I played in the wetlands that were formed when they put the big groins out in the river, and then I left town and I came back, and this little narrow, really fast thing that used to be this great big grand river is now the Missouri River. And so that got me really thinking about rivers. And unfortunately, I haven't worked on the Missouri, but I have had a really good chance to work on the Mississippi River quite a bit. And what I want to talk about today is how we can apply some of the geologic work we do, some of the geologic mapping we do to address restoration issues in the Mississippi Valley. Oh, I got to turn it on, that's right. Aha. Yeah, it works. All right. Okay. Yeah, I don't ever work alone. I don't like working alone. It's no fun. You get in trouble. You break your ankle or something, and you're in a ditch, and nobody's there to get you. So I've worked on this project a lot with two people, especially Chuck Thieling, who's a large river ecologist, works for the Corps of Engineers, the Rock Island District, and Ed Hajek, who's a geologist, fellow geologist. I've known Ed for a really long time. He's associated with the Illinois State Museum, but he lives in Santa Fe. Okay, so he likes to drive, what Ed likes to do. So we've done a lot of work on the Mississippi together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about sort of three aspects of things here. First off, I'm going to talk a little bit about some conceptual models of river network structure and function, okay? I'm a geologist. I'm not an ecologist, but I'm going to try to bungle my way through a little bit of ecology here, okay? And I'm going to talk about the upper Mississippi Valley river history, okay, and the geological situation in the upper Mississippi River Valley. And then I'm going to try to put these two things together and give you some insights into some things that we're just starting, especially with Chuck, to put this geologic information to some sort of river management application. Okay, if you're familiar at all with large river ecology and large river ecology theory, there's one concept or model, Vanote and his others proposed in the 1980s, the river continuum concept. And this is sort of like one of the big things that happened in the last century that's been driving river ecology research for a long time. And the whole idea behind this is that you've got physical things in rivers. They're slope, bed load material, channel depth, that sort of thing. And they change in a systematic fashion from the headwaters down towards the mouth of the river. Okay, so it's a continuum. You see these progressive changes. And these changes in these physical attributes, and some of them are like discharge, also influence the ecological setting in the river. And they affect what's going on as far as various sorts of organisms, the habitats that are present, various sorts of primary productivity that's taking place. You have a large amount of coarse organic debris in the headwaters, much more fine organic debris farther down. There's less storage of organic matter in the headwaters, more storage in the lower reaches. And so there's this continuum, and it's been used as a model for predicting ecosystem function in large rivers. But it's also come under a lot of criticism because people have gone out, and there are many situations and many examples that have been brought up where it's not a continuum, where there's discontinuities, and you can't predict things. So for instance, one of the big ones is, especially in the larger animals, you don't find, the catfish only in the lower part of the reach. You find them in the upper reaches too. And so there's these habitats that aren't really continuous as far as their distribution from one end of the river system to the other. And sort of a concept that is starting to catch on is pretty popular now. This river ecosystem synthesis is really an attempt by Thorpe and others to sort of fill in the gaps with this original concept of continuity, and basically say that, we can model this thing, but we need to model it in a little bit different way. And so this riverine ecosystem synthesis is it's a model for river lotic biocomplexity. And the thing about it is it can be dealt with across several spatial and temporal scales. That was always a big problem with the river continuum concept, was the spatial and temporal variability. This synthesis is a framework for understanding sort of these broad patterns that, like the continuum dealt with, across longitudinal things, but also smaller scale things that occur across in a given reach, where like a tributary joins from one side of a main channel to a side channel, that sort of thing. So it allows you to deal with things on many more scales and allows you to really come closer to the reality of the thing. Of course, along with that, you lose predictive capabilities sometimes. Okay? And so really what this riverine ecosystem synthesis does then is it portrays rivers as arrays of hydrogeomorphic patches, and I'll talk about what hydrogeomorphic patch is in a little bit. And the main control, just like in the river continuum concept, is catchment geomorphology and climate, because those are the things that control the materials and the water. Okay? And it's the materials and the water that really drive the system. It's the variations in those two things that are driving the system. So a hydrogeomorphic patch, in its simplest form, is defined by variations or shifts in the hydrologic and the geomorphic conditions. So in this case, I've got two pictures of this point bar, one at low stage, one at high stage. And what you see is there's spatial zonation of hydrologic characteristics. So, at low stage, the water's here, this area is dry. At high stage, the water's here. This area here is a little bit elevated, so it's still drier, but there's wet in behind here in these little channel chutes, okay? So during one time of the year, you've got this kind of a condition. The second time of year, you've got this kind of a condition. So there's variations across this small thing in these different hydrological characteristics, and it's related to sort of the river seasonal flood pulse, okay? There's also differences in geomorphic patterns. So in this case, we've got a point bar. Back over here, we might have the floodplain. There might be different kinds of materials, different kinds of soils. Even on a local scale, there can be variations in the materials that are present across this thing. So there's all sorts of different scales that you can deal with just looking at differences in hydrology and how water is moving through the system and the materials which affect soils and other sorts of things. So you can conceptualize valleys then as these arrays or systems of hydrogeomorphic patches, okay? And the hydrogeomorphic patches each differ from an adjacent patch because of differences in how the hydrologic system is affecting the landforms, the materials in that patch, okay? And they reoccur along the river profile, just like I'll show you a couple examples, okay? They're not, you only just have one here and then you never see it again. They actually reoccur, these situations reoccur over and over along the river profile, and they end up giving you this patchy framework that was always a problem for the river continuum concept, okay? And like I said before, you can deal with it at a bunch of scales, and I'll talk about that too. So just an example here. Okay, here's the, the classic photo of the Mississippi River 1993 flood down here. And here's the river not in flood. And you can see, just looking at it from above, that you've got, different kinds of situations here. You've got this little reach of the Missouri River right here, which is a very narrow reach, okay? Even in flood, it doesn't, not much water goes out onto the floodplain. There's not much floodplain for it to go out onto. Back in here, this area undergoes a huge change just because of the flood pulse here, okay? Whereas this out here, this little lake, always is water, regardless of whether you're in flood or not, okay? And the same thing holds for the Mississippi. So there's, on a really broad, big scale, you can see that there are parts of valleys that are very distinct from other parts of valleys, and that these patterns can be repeated as you go down the valley. On a smaller scale, so here we're just looking at one stretch of the Iowa River, just take a look at the point bars. These are point bars here. They're repeated as you go down the river. In every case, they're sandy. Some of them have a little bit of fine sediment up here. They have an area behind them that doesn't go underwater as often, that has more trees established on it. Often there are more fine-grained deposits back in there. They're even present here where you've got a situation where it's not directly connected to the channel, but they're repeated as you go down the river over and over again. You get this same set of conditions that goes underwater during high stage, is emergent during low stage, is sandy, is pretty, in this case, pretty unstable, and a lot of disturbance going on there. So you can look at it on a small scale too. So really, each hydrogeomorphic patch or type of hydrogeomorphic patch has unique kinds of characteristics, okay? And they differ in these physical conditions, and by physical I mean both the materials as well as the hydrology that's going on. And that also means that they're going to differ in sort of chemical conditions, geochemistry that's taking place there, because there's going to be an interaction between the materials, the water, and the organisms that is going to cause some sort of kind of unique geochemical signatures that will be associated with certain kinds of hydrogeomorphic patches. And therefore, ecological communities should differ from one patch to the next too. So that's what we see in this, photo here. There's different kinds of communities present out here than there are back in here, okay? Or out in here in this oxbow than there is back in this floodplain area. And so really the pattern of ecological structure and function in the river is controlled by the distribution of these hydrogeomorphic patches. And this is just a little diagram that shows, it's all related to everything else, okay, in the thing. You can't really separate out one thing alone, but basically what we're talking about are these two things and this thing. And really when you put those together, you end up encompassing this part of the system too. That's not to say that biota isn't an active player in this thing. Obviously it is. It controls sedimentation, local sedimentation patterns. It has a really huge influence on other parts of the biota, and also has a really giant influence on the geochemistry too. But it's easier to predict and to map the sediments and the hydrology. Okay, one more thing, functional process zones, okay? These things are the territory of river ecologists, okay? This is the ecological part of the thing here, where they're basically ecological functions that are controlled by the physical characteristics taking place in that zone. Okay, so you can once again, in Tom et al.'s paper, they tend to look at, and I'll show you a diagram a little bit, they look at functional process zones as pretty good sized reaches of rivers is one way to look at them. So you can see that narrow valley reach versus the large, wider valley reach could be a functional process zone, or a large tributary junction versus the area above it, okay? But I think you can also look at them actually at even smaller scales too. And really the whole deal is, since this hydrogeomorphic patches differ from each other in physical and chemical conditions, the ecological conditions and processes in those patches should differ from each other too, okay? And so that basically you can take this hydrogeomorphic patch and use it as a template for functional process zones. So determining a functional process zone is not an easy thing to do. There's a whole lot of information you're going to have to gather out there. You're going to have to do all kinds of vegetation and animal surveys. You're going to have to know about what kinds of primary production there's taking place. There's all sorts of information you need to know. Whereas I think with the hydrogeomorphic patches in their simplest form, you can kind of step back and get information, and I'll show you a little bit, that's a lot easier to get a hold of. And this at least gives you a general idea of what kinds of ecological processes and functions might be taking place or might be happening or might be associated with that patch. So here's Thorpe et al.'s river ecosystem synthesis, and this is the important thing to think about. This is it's with rivers, it's really large rivers especially, you have big scale differences, okay? So here we're at the big large scale here, okay? And at large scales, looking at a whole basin, recovery rates are really long, okay? Once you have narrowed down the Missouri River and stuck it in this little rockline channel, it's going to take an awful long time to bring it out of that, no matter what you do, okay? But as you go down in scale, so here's their functional process zone, which is a reach. They go into a river reach, and then there's a functional set, so there's a certain little environment that occurs along this part of the channel that's unique from one above and one below. You can go into a channel cross-section where you're actually seeing differences going across the cross-section, and then there's little mesohabitats, okay? And as you go through each of these, you get shorter and shorter recovery time. And I'd argue that this functional process zone, the concept anyway, can probably step down at least into these scales here. Okay, so totally change directions for a minute here, okay? I'm going to jerk you out of the that stuff, and we're just going to talk about Upper Mississippi River Valley fluvial history and stratigraphic framework, because this is going to be one of the big pieces of the template that we're going to put together for the hydrogeomorphic patches. So this is essentially the zone. This is one of my favorite maps to look at because it's so wrong. Yeah, if you know anything about the rivers of Iowa, the Des Moines River does not head there. The Des Moines River comes here and goes up here, right? This is the pre-last glacial Des Moines River. What a great map. The guy didn't know it, but he was actually putting it in the right spot because that's what really should be were it not for the last glacier. Okay, so last glacial, and really the Mississippi Valley, in our part of the world, the upper Mississippi Valley, all the landforms and the sediments that we see that are really in the valley are from the last glacial period, by and large, okay? The stuff that's older than that is essentially, as far as plants and animals are concerned, upland. It's out of the picture a long ways, okay? Okay, so during the last glacial period, sediment and water discharge is driven by a bunch of things, but mostly glacial meltwater system. There's glaciers in the headwaters of the basin, okay? And there's also lakes that are out in front of the glaciers, proglacial lakes. And then there's also climate happening, okay? And one important thing to sort of think about, and periglacial processes are just processes that happen when you have very cold conditions, okay? That you have a thaw, but it also you return to very cold conditions. And there's one of your periglacial condition expert guys right over there in the white hair and the blue shirt. So it's these things here that are really driving the system, that's putting sediment and putting water into the Mississippi. And so we have a valley train, and a valley train is just a river valley that has sediment and water that's derived from a glacier that's moving down the glacier. And in this case, big glaciers, valley train goes all the way down the river a long ways, okay? So until about KA is 1,000 years ago, okay, until about 12,400, 500 years ago, we have a braided stream. So we have a bunch of different channels running all over the place. They're very intermittent. They move all over the place, okay? The river valley, the floodplain, is broad, and it's a really steep gradient, much steeper than it is today. And essentially, white lie number one, the valley is filling up. It's actually going like this a lot, but it's lots of sediment starting to accumulate. So here's my time machine picture of the upper Mississippi River Valley. This is what it would have looked like, minus the schists in the background. But this is a braided stream, okay? And this is what the sediment looks like. This is real live last glacial sediment from the Mississippi River Valley. It's, you know, sands with a little bit of pebbly sands and gravels, okay? Pretty coarse grained stuff, and water passes through it really readily. Then you have this big glacial Holocene transition. So it's basically the transition that occurs when we come out of the last glacial period into the present sort of interglacial period, okay? It happens between about 13,000 and maybe 10,800 years ago. And what happens, the big difference is that the meltwater that's coming out of the glaciers by this time passes through proglacial lakes before it gets into the river, okay? That has a big influence because what happens is all the coarse sediment gets trapped in the lakes. And so you're basically putting much more sediment-free water into the system, which has a really huge influence on the river itself. Also, every once in a while, a glacial lake catastrophically drains or spills out and a big flood comes down the river. And what happens in this period is that you have general incision of the valley, so it cuts down. And what it does, it doesn't sort of cut down uniformly. It cuts down more in the headwaters than down below, so that the gradient gets less and less, like this, okay? And what this does then is as we go farther up the valley here, it means that these glacial terraces become more and more elevated above the floodplain. They become big high terraces. There's also a pattern shift from this braided pattern to something akin to what we have today, an island braided pattern. Big islands with channel on either side of it. It's relatively stable. Avulsions are really common, and what an avulsion is it's a wholesale abandonment of a stretch of river, okay, and its floodplain. And these things are really common because you have these really big floods every once in a while. And the rivers jump from one place to the next. And what happens is you end up abandoning a big stretch of the river floodplain area and the channel area, and the river jumps to another place on the other side of the valley somewhere. Also during this period, the channel belt narrows, and the channel belt is that part of the floodplain that the river kind of moves around in quite a bit, okay? It narrows down, and then you also shift to where you're not transporting all the fine stuff out of the valley anymore, that there's more fine material and sandy material, and you start depositing fine materials on the floodplain. So lots of big changes happen in this period. And then as we get into what's called the Holocene, this is the early part of the Holocene, we shift from this control on river system from glaciers and glacial lakes with regional meteorological control to solely regional meteorological control on water and sediment discharge. And meteorological writ big. The climate affects the vegetation affects how what the rainfall does when it falls on the surface, and that affects what's going on as far as moving sediment into the system, okay? So there's a lot going on there. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but this is the area we're interested in. These are sort of dominant air masses, and it's the interplay between several of these air masses that really cause variations through this period and through the subsequent period in the amount of water and the amount of sediment that's being delivered to the Mississippi Valley. So, for instance, this is the Arctic, this is the polar front in the winter, okay, it sits down here. This is a called Gulf air, maritime tropical air, moist, warm. This is the stuff that comes swinging up here in April, May, and we start dumping a bunch of water on us with big thunderstorms as these two air masses collide. And then there's this Pacific air, which comes across, and it's drier air because it's got the moisture squeezed out of it from going across the mountains. And when this air mass becomes dominant through the spring and the summer and the fall, we end up with drought, long-term drought, okay? And so yeah, that's just a real general pattern of vegetation, large-scale communities in the area that we're dealing with. And you can see, you know, this is basically that polar front dominant zone right here. To the north of that, we have mixed forests and finally boreal forests. This is where the Gulf air bops up into here, and we have hardwood forests down here. And then this is the area where the Pacific air, when we do get droughts, tends to dominate through here. And so this is why we have the Prairie Peninsula. It's this dry plus the fire regime that takes place, and we have savanna and prairie. So it's really, the whole system is controlled by this large-scale climate system. And what we end up with is, these are just a couple records of pollen records and speleothem records, going from 9,000 to 1,000. This one's 12 to 1,000. And this is Kirchner Marsh up in Minnesota, west of the Twin Cities a little bit. It's Roberts Creek up in northeast Iowa. And all this is showing is that here's the glacial period. The green here is this early Holocene where we've got mostly forests. The pink, or whatever salmon color I guess it is where we get a dominance of prairie. And then the yellow is sort of like conditions that would have been kind of close to historic time, where we have a little more moisture and a little more forest, but also sort of a mixed prairie forest out there. And this sort of thing affects the whole basin, essentially, okay? So it's going to have big influences on the sediments that are going on. And so what happens during this period is, indeed, lots of different things happen. The Mississippi River really settles into its meander belt. So where you see the Mississippi today, for the most part, is where it's been for about the last 7,000 years. Okay? It's pretty amazing how stable it is. And because of that, you develop these extensive back swamps. So these are the rivers where it's wide, there's a big extensive floodplain, and when the river floods, it forms these areas that are inundated that dry out slowly. Those are the back swamps. Oxbow lakes are really common, and oxbow because the river isn't really highly meandering in many places up here. So these things form where you've had these large avulsions, where you abandon a big chunk of channel area. Like here's one right here. So these are open water lakes in this period, okay? Large ones out there in the floodplain. And then alluvial fans are sort of cone-shaped landforms that build when streams that are small tributary valleys that are coming out of the upland hit this low gradient floodplain. They kind of spread their sediment out, and they're like this. They're high on this end, they're low on the large valley end, and they start to build out into the main valley during this period too. After about 7,000, channel belt stays stable, and because the channel belt's staying stable, the river's sitting pretty much in the same spot. During floods, it keeps flooding over the same spot, and as water escapes the channel, it initially spreads out, gets thinner, and drops behind the coarsest load. And so what happens is eventually you start building up these ridges that border the channel, and those are natural levees. They become high spots adjacent to the channel. Alluvial fans continue to build, and then these riverine wetlands, these oxbow lakes that were sitting out there, or open water, start going through a whole series of evolution. They start filling with sediment. Some of them start to undergo eutrophication. There's a whole sequence of changes that start to happen in these riverine wetlands. And then the channel belt stays pretty stable in this period where we get more trees, more moisture in the late Holocene. Flood frequency increases. They're not as big of floods, but they're more frequent floods. And that sort of causes the floodplain to start to build up with fine-grained sediment pretty quickly. And then after 1800, all hell breaks loose because they, Europeans come in, take all the trees off the slopes, start really messing with stuff a whole lot. And it really upsets the system considerably, and it's still adjusting to it today. So this is just a picture to show you, these changes that are happening that are climatically driven are really important. This is a picture. I think you can see there's a difference on this side and this side in color. This is a little grayer. This is a little redder, okay? Well, this is less than 4,000 years. This is greater than 6,000 years. And this is a pattern you see everywhere in the Mississippi Valley. And the reason this is grayer is it has more organic matter in it, okay? A little more organic matter, a little more clay. And the important thing for our purposes is that that little bit more organic matter and a little bit more clay causes real differences in how water moves through this material and causes real differences in the geochemical environment that's present in these things. These things here can have a lot more anoxic conditions, easier, okay? These tend to be a lot more oxic conditions, not necessarily more well-drained, but they tend to promote more or less reactions that involve bacterial oxidation or deoxidation. Okay, so the reason I went through all this stuff is we can actually map these things out, okay? The big difference, there's two, and don't worry about this, it's just a geology term. There's two main differences. One is those glacial sands and gravels. That's the orange stuff. That's the muscatine, okay? That's going to be sandy, gravelly, sits as a terrace, really well drained, freely drained, okay? And then the other one is this Ocakwa, which is the rest of it, the Holocene stuff, okay? And it sits lower, has more fine-grained materials. There's also some sands underneath it all, okay? But it also includes these oxbows, levees, alluvial fans, and it's in a lower spot, but there's variations in it too. So you can actually map out different settings from air photos, really, on the basis of differences in elevation, cutting relationships, different kinds of patterns of things on there. So it's really pretty straightforward once you have a framework to go out and start doing this kind of mapping. And here's one example. This is Lake Odessa, down south of Muscatine, Illinois over here. And this is just, the M stands for the muscatine, the sandy stuff. The O stands for the Ocakwa, the more fine-grained material. And right here is a high sandy terrace. This area right in here is also a high sandy terrace. And you can see, the first thing that jumps out here is that's the only place that's being cultivated. And there's a reason, because the rest of Odessa is pretty darn wet most of the time, okay? And so you can go in there and you can map out these things relatively easily once you have a framework to work with. So it's a doable project. Okay, so back off the history. Now we're going to go into, okay, how can we use this stuff? How are we going to go with this, okay? So sort of a reminder, what defines a hydrogeomorphic patch, okay? So it's interactions among the hydrologic patterns. So we're talking about the flood pulse as well as a hydrologic pattern. We can also think about, how easily water moves into sediments from the channel and from the sediments back into the channel. So during high water, you'll get flow into the banks. during the receding stage, and in low water you can get flow out of the banks, okay? So this is flooding frequency and duration. It obviously varies down the valley. And then there's this term connectivity, okay? That's basically how easy it is for interactions to take place between the main river and the floodplain, or between the river channel and side channels, okay? It's how much interaction there is. And the interaction depends upon both surface physical connection, channels to move through, as well as what the materials are like, okay? Also, the geomorphic template is really critical in the hydrogeomorphic patch, okay? So we're looking at landform sizes and shapes. This sort of thing we can map, like I just showed you, from the air once we have a framework. Soils are important at smaller scales. As you get into bigger valley reach scales, soils become less important because the landforms themselves, I think, define the thing better, okay? And then there's also a lot of other things involved in the sediments themselves, organic matter content, nutrients, that sort of stuff. And then finally, with the thing, we've got the organic template too, okay? So the vegetation, the other organisms, okay? So this sort of stuff you really want to be able to get if you're going to do this. So how do we do it, okay? First of all, you try to determine some sort of reference condition or something like that, a pre-impact condition, okay, and ecological processes. And you do this pretty standard. I mean, you guys do the same thing when you're out there going to restore a prairie. You know, you look at the geology, you look at the soils, the topography, the hydrology, and the biology. And this stuff, you know, we can go out there and do this mapping. This stuff is available free from, you know, everywhere in Iowa. Topographic maps, LiDAR surveys, whatever. Hydrology, that information is available from the USGS and from the Corps of Engineers in the large river. And then this sort of thing, you know, you can get from GLO surveys for at least a start, okay? And then what you do is you can compare this historic situation, and some of it you got to do a little reconstruction with, you know, especially like hydrology. You compare that with the current landscape, okay? So you have the current condition and your past reference pre-disturbance condition, or whatever you wanted to. And so you determine the alterations that have taken place in the hydrologic condition, the topography, the vegetation community and structure, the resource availability, all this sort of stuff, okay? So you've got what was there and what the structure was like and what the processes were like before it was disturbed, what's there now, and you compare these two to get options and approaches, okay? Because we're never going to go there, not in a big valley. There's too many things that have happened to allow us to go back and, you know, mimic exactly what was there, especially for specific places, okay? We can mimic processes, we can mimic function, but we might not be able to do it in the same place exactly that it was back before the disturbance, okay? And so what this approach is it's a good, I think, useful approach and a very productive approach for allowing you to look at options, okay? Allows you to see, okay, we want to restore certain ecological conditions or habitats. Where's the best place to go about doing that, okay? So here's an example. This is Pool 8 in the upper Mississippi. This is the Apple River right here. And this is the geologic framework here. These are the high sandy terraces. This color here is upland. And then this right here, whoops, this brown is the Holocene Occoquan, okay? And this is a GLO reconstruction, 1890s. This is downloaded from the USGS in La Crosse. You can see, number one, there's not nearly as much water as there was because we don't have a dam right here, okay? It's real patchy, but even so, you can still see that, you know, these areas that are sandy were the places where we had the grasses and forbs most commonly, and also the first place where agriculture moved in, okay? So here we are in 1989. This is a lock and dam here. We've got open water here, and you can see there's a huge change, okay? We've lost all this patchiness at the expense of marsh, and the ability to go in and try to mimic this again just is not going to be here. We just can't do it. You can't see it here, but the whole structure in here is different. You know, these are all little channels and little low spots and high spots. Sedimentation in here has really flattened this thing out too. So it's a really very low relief, marshy, shallow water area, which is a big problem actually for the Corps and for the restoration people, because there's very little benthic diversity across this thing. So in this case, you know, what you can see is that, okay, there are a few places where we might be able to go in and do this, but these are not, this is not the area we're going to do it down here. Okay, so data sets that we need, soils, like I said, they're available everywhere. You just, you can download these things free. They are very useful. You need to know a little bit about soils. They're very useful in some places and very unuseful in other places. Anywhere where it's not likely somebody's going to grow something or use farm machinery, they're really crappy because there's no interest in spending time out there to do that, okay? But where you've got good agricultural potential, the soils are pretty good information, okay? With LiDAR data now, wow, you can do stuff that's just amazing. Here's a water depth map that you throw in for, this is part of the Iowa River, where you can actually say, there's a 2-year flood. And here's what the water depths would be at the 2-year flood interval. So this gives you really good information on where to target certain kinds of habitat and certain kinds of floodplain communities that like to be flooded, or parts of floodplain communities that don't like to be flooded. So if property comes up for sale and you want to sort of restore a mesic bottomland, and this is the chunk of property, pass it by. Pass it by. It's not going to work, okay? So you can apply these things, like I said, at many scales. So there's the valley scale, okay? And this is often the scale, well, this is the really big scale. So here the Mississippi Valley, you can do it a couple ways. This is the upper impounded reach. This is where all the locks and dams are that actually have big open water pools behind them. And that's because the valley's steeper in that area, okay? Lower impounded reach, this is where we've got locks and dams, but we've got really wide valley down here. And so the pools are much less extensive and there's much more floodplain area out there. The Illinois is its own little river, and then the unimpounded reach below St. Louis where there are no locks and dams. Okay, and so each of these has its own unique kind of characteristics that would, if you're looking at it on a big river, valley wide, basin wide scale, these are important ways to look at it, okay? This one over here we won't talk as much about, but it's the same sort of thing, only this one uses valley gradient. Or you can go to a reach scale, and this is the scale that's sort of most familiar when you're talking about the river ecosystem synthesis scale. This is the kind of scale that a lot of large river ecologists start to deal with, where this is the reach right in here. This is Muscatine's up here. This is the Iowa River Junction. Let's see where, here. And Burlington sits down here. Excuse me, that's the Des Moines. And so, you know, in this case, we've got our mapping, our landform sediment assemblage mapping, basically our materials, and the yellows are the high terraces. These are the various sorts of low terraces you can kind of break out. Yep.
Yeah, how do you decide what a reach is?
It's totally up to you, whatever you want it to be. Yeah, this is the terminology of the Corps of Engineers. This is what they consider to be a reach.
Like 10 miles or what?
What I would think a reach would be where you get a big difference in valley scale geomorphology. So this is pretty wide valley. This would be a gorge reach here. And then down here, I mean, you can make your reaches on any kind of criteria you want to make your reaches, I think. You could also narrow down some and say, okay, we're going to deal with this reach here, which is more flooded because of the lock and dam than this reach down here. Or maybe this reach down here because you've got this little anabranch channel down here. So you can, yeah, go where you want to go with the word reach. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But you can start doing kind of cool things. This is a plot where this is up at the top, this is down at the bottom, these are river miles. And you can plot the acres of each of those various classifications in that stretch, okay? So this is useful for like the Corps of Engineers because they have deed on quite a bit of this. They have agreements on a lot of this. And so if they're starting some sort of a restoration project that's long-term, that is going to involve getting land or figuring out where like a wildlife refuge is going to go in, this sort of information can give them a real quick, really large-scale look at where the various sorts of options occur. So let's say you're going for prairie. You want to find a big prairie area. You're going to need pretty well-drained areas that don't flood very much, okay? So those are the yellow ones. Good spots up here. This is really a lousy area down here, okay? So you can sort of use it at that scale as a planner. You can go to the sub-pool or local scale. This could also be reach, okay? This is Odessa again. So here, you know, you can use it to map out, once again, in Odessa. This would be pretty good stuff for savanna or prairie, okay? As with this over here. This is sort of a higher fine-grain floodplain that doesn't flood, okay? So this would be a good hardwood forest area back in here. These are obviously not as good hardwood forest areas in here, but there's also some little areas that if you start looking closely, like right in here is one, this one right here, it's a little bit higher, and this is where, as it turns out, on this O2A is the only place where white oaks are present in Odessa, because they're about that much above the average 2-year flood, so they don't get wet feet all the time. So what you can do, this is just sort of a methodology thing. I just love LiDAR because you can do fun stuff with it. So you get this DEM that's built off LiDAR, okay? And you can draw an elevation across a given cross section and say, okay, that elevation is the elevation of the 2-year flood, or whatever frequency flood you want. You can ramp them up to, this is recurrence interval, okay? So this flood's going to happen every 2 years, so every 100 years, okay? And what you can do is you start out with, this is all downloadable free. You can get the LiDAR. You have to draw flow frequency cross sections because the actual gradient and shape of the valley controls where the elevation of that flood pulse is going to fall, okay? These are available. There's the Corps of Engineers has flow frequency spots all along the valley. It's pretty easy to come up with these. And then what you do is you make this series of lines into a space. Okay, you connect it together with this tin conversion. Then from the tin conversion, you can basically take the area, the elevation that you're interested in, mask it out, and you come up with a grid, and then you turn that into a shapefile. So for instance, this is the area that's flooded in whatever frequency flood you've got for this area. So here's a cool thing that we did. This is a fun one. This is the Iowa River Junction once again here. And this is low flow conditions. There are levee districts here, okay, because there's a dam down here, a lock and dam, and there's levees along here. And these levee districts, some of them are they're semi-political districts, I guess is what you'd say. They're independent of the Corps, okay? And they have pumps that pump water out of these things to maintain agricultural use behind the levee. If you turned off the pumps, this is what you'd have. The blue is the water. This is the condition you'd have, okay? This is the 2-year flood with the pumps off, and this is the 5-year flood and so on. And the important thing is that once you're at the 2-year flood, you've essentially flooded most of what you're going to flood in this reach. And the Corps is interested in dealing with nutrients and also restoring ecosystems in the upper Mississippi Valley. One way that's been suggested is for them to acquire rights to flood some levee districts. Okay, they could generate big wetlands really easy. They could also figure out, you know, okay, here's the areas that in a 2-year flood, we can take the flood pulse downstream off by letting these areas flood. And then depending upon how fast we release it, we could do nutrient management in that water with these areas too. So it's interesting stuff from their viewpoint. From another way to look at stuff, this is inundation once again, okay? So here we've got that same area where we've got the 1890s aquatic areas, 1989 aquatic areas, and then we did a flood simulation through here. And so each of these is a different recurrence interval, getting less and less. This is a 500-year flood here. And so here's the contemporary situation. You never flood these high sandy areas. you basically flood almost everything else. This is what the situation used to be like in 1890, before the lock and dam was in there, and before all the filling occurred down there. Once again, these never flood, but you can see it takes a whole lot more flood water to start to put things underwater here than it does today. So once again, if you're trying to, reconstruct either function or communities, you're faced with places where they used to be that you can't do it today. It's just not going to work as well. So you need to sort of change your location if you're going to pull it off. This is a geochemical one, big scroll bar. The reds are high, the greens are low. It's about 3.5 meters difference in the two. We did a bunch of work as it worked from Keith Schilling and Ron Jacobson. And they looked at really shallow wells. They call them groundwater. They're about 10 feet below the surface to 8 feet below the surface. So it's the zone that there's a lot of biological activity in. A lot of the roots are in that zone still. And it's the sort of interface between the real live deep groundwater and the water that's moving through the soil to the groundwater. And what they found is that they've got really two geochemical environments here. Up here in these higher areas where there's sandier material, you've got less dissolved solids, really good amounts of dissolved oxygen, and the oxidation reduction potential is really high. Okay, in these lower lying areas where there's fine grained stuff, you get anoxic conditions really easily. You have much greater dissolved solids, really different geochemical situations. Those are going to impact function. Here we're going to be able to denitrify materials. Here it's not going to happen. And then if you take it, a big reach scale, this is what the Corps is interested in, lay a bunch of these layers together, and then you make some decisions about what the requirements and tolerances of certain species might be, or certain communities. You even move to a community if you wanted to, okay? And so where are the best conditions to do these various sorts of things? So the wet floodplain forest, this is where we have those lower lying areas that go underwater during the 2-year flood but don't remain underwater very long, okay? The mesic floodplain forest, once again, maybe goes underwater sometime between the 2 and the 5-year flood frequency, but has sandy materials pretty close to the surface so that there's usually pretty good oxygenation. Poplar and willow, these are the wet places that can really hang out, mostly big tributary junctions, right? And then prairie, obviously those higher sandy places that aren't going to get flooded as much. So large scale planning, large scale potential can be dealt with at this stuff. So conclusions, there's these two major fluvial styles that really sort of set the big framework for sandy, gravelly, well-drained stuff, lower, fine-grained material that's not as well drained, but it has quite a bit of variability, going from really poorly drained to moderately well drained, from really frequently flooded to infrequently or not flooded very often at all. And you can map these things, okay? We have a framework for it. In fact, the mapping's already been done in the Mississippi Valley at the big scale, okay? These geologic materials and hydrologic patterns really strongly influence the physical-chemical conditions that are present in those places, okay? And those things control community structure and function. And you can deal with this at a bunch of different spatial and temporal scales, too. At the scale of things like Odessa or smaller places where, like, say you're going to acquire 10 acres, we probably don't have the mapping sufficient to do that yet, everywhere, okay? But with the coarser scale maps, we can hone in on a few places. And then finally, geologic mapping then is really a key resource for doing this sort of thing. It's probably the easiest to get information that's out there that actually gives you the most bang for the buck if you're trying to deal with a thing of this scale. That's it. Thanks.
Any questions for Dr. Bettis?
How much of that is actually being done, of using this information and putting it on the ground?
Very little. The real challenge, the real challenge is getting inroads into the way it's always been done.
Yeah.
Yep, that's it, exactly. The one positive thing I can say is that Chuck Thieling's on board. And Chuck's the large river ecologist for the Corps. And so he has colleagues that work on this stuff with the USGS. And that's where we're going. We're trying to talk to them and to get them to try out a couple of these things. It would be mostly in the upper part, above Pool 8, that they would, because that's where they're focusing their work. But also, we have a project going actually with LACMERS, with the Institute for Hydraulic Research. I work with them, and we've got a project going at Odessa right now that's doing this. So we're doing a demo project to convince the USGS that it works in Odessa. And Odessa is a good place to do it because we have a good range of stuff, and it's that sort of intermediate scale that's a good scale for that sort of planning that they want to do.
So when you read about some of these early explorers coming up on the bank of the Mississippi, they talk about large expanses of prairie coming right down to the river.
Mm-hmm.
Then they must have been on that sandy.
Mostly, although you know how it is. There's a temporal framework there. If you had a place that was maybe, let's say, a big crevasse splay where a natural levee gets breached, and you'll often blast this big sandy area out into one of these broad valley reaches, like down by Quincy. Those can support prairie too. If you can just keep the fire in there. That's the trick, I think, is to have a mechanism for getting the fire frequency in there, whether it's some sort of wind disturbance or it's not just all materials and all hydrology. There's also sort of configuration, because fire's the wild card in this whole thing that, has to be there. Otherwise it'd all be woods, because it never gets dry enough to kill the trees here. Yeah, Laura.
So we have these remnant savannas along floodplains on the Cedar River where you see big trees that are now encroached upon, and some efforts to do some restoration of those sites, reintroduce fire and so forth. And there's some remnant plant populations that are prairie, sand prairie types of things. But I'm wondering whether your approaches would help us to figure out whether that was, whether those efforts were doomed or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that what you can do with this is you can get at a most probable, where you can get the most bang for the buck kind of look at things. I mean, you can, if you're willing to put the effort into it, you can grow whatever you want to grow almost anywhere in these things. But,
But there is it the case that there's vegetation along the Mississippi and probably along the Cedar as well that is remnant of an earlier hydrological regime?
Yeah, that's a good point, because since about 1860, for the most part, depending upon how close you are to the channel, and it varies all over the place, but there's a good meter of sediment on the floodplain that wasn't there. That has a huge impact on what's going on out there, okay? The other thing is, there's a scale issue here. If you've got a 5-acre area that you're restoring, well, that doesn't even show up in these early surveys unless it happened to fall on a survey line. And so, there's the patchiness of what was there may not be represented as well as we want it to be, and depending upon how you have to match the scale of the mapping to the scale of the project, I guess is what I'm going to say. So if you're interested in fairly small, specific, what you want to do is you get an idea where to go, but then when you've decided on a few areas, you want to go out there and do some groundwork and look, and see what the specific situation is there. Because, mapping from a photo or mapping from the ground or just walking around, I mean, anybody that's done any mapping, there's a lot out there, and you're going to miss some stuff, and it's not until you look at the really close details of things that you really understand what's really going on at a given place. So this is more of a guide than a absolute, this is where it has to be.
Whether we're seeing time lags between the vegetation is telling us one thing was possible at the time that
Mhm.
tree or that plant established, but maybe it's not possible now because it changed.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's lots of scales of that too. Like for instance, there are lots of soils in eastern Iowa that are these intergrades between forest soils and prairie soils. Why are they? Well, because at one time they were either a forest soil that became a prairie soil, or one time they were a prairie soil that became a forest. And that didn't happen overnight. You know, and so that's, yeah, there's changes like that all the time. That's, I guess, the, you know, going back to what it was in 1880, well, 1880 was a moving target. That's just a picture, you know, it's just a picture. It's just sort of a possibility given the condition of what's there. And it doesn't reflect an adjustment to the condition by any means. It doesn't have to, especially in a river valley. River valleys are really dynamic environments. And so, you know, I would think that the one thing that really makes the river valleys is they're incredibly dynamic. And so they should have lots and lots of, you know, situations where plant communities aren't totally adjusted to that situation. You know, I think you get a lot of mixes of things in river valleys that you don't typically see other places, because there's a lot of patchiness, huge patchiness on really small scales. And that patchiness can happen in, you know, a day. You can go from no sand to 10 feet of sand at a spot. Well, thanks a lot for having me up. It was good to come up here.